Imagine going back 9,000 years. There are no bars, no breweries, no liquor stores, no advertisements telling people to drink responsibly. And yet, someone, somewhere, had already discovered how to turn ordinary food into an intoxicating drink. But here's the strange part. Humans didn't need alcohol to survive. So why did they start making it? Was it an accident? Was it used for medicine? Was it part of ancient religious rituals? Or did humans actually develop a taste for alcohol long before civilization even existed? The answer begins with something much older than beer, something growing on trees, fruit. Long before humans learned to brew beer, nature was already making alcohol. When ripe fruit sits around long enough, naturally occurring yeast can consume its sugars, and one of the byproducts is ethanol, the same type of alcohol found in beer, wine, and spirits today. This means our ancestors may have encountered alcohol without making it themselves. A fallen piece of fruit could become slightly fermented. It might smell different, taste different, and contain a small amount of alcohol. And humans weren't the only animals encountering it. Many fruit-eating animals naturally consume small amounts of ethanol in fermented fruit. Scientists have even found evidence suggesting that our primate ancestors were exposed to dietary alcohol millions of years ago. This idea is sometimes called the drunken monkey hypothesis. The basic idea is surprisingly simple. If your ancestors spent millions of years searching for ripe fruit, they may also have learned to recognize the smells associated with fermentation. And that creates an interesting evolutionary connection. Alcohol wasn't necessarily something humans suddenly discovered. It may have been something our ancestors had already been encountering for millions of years. But naturally, fermented fruit contains relatively low levels of alcohol. So that still doesn't explain something much more impressive. How did humans go from eating fermented fruit to deliberately making alcoholic beverages? For that, we have to go back to the Stone Age. Imagine an ancient village. Someone has collected fruit, grain, or honey. The food is stored inside a container. Days pass, then something strange happens. Yeast begins breaking down the sugars. The mixture starts fermenting. Bubbles appear. The smell changes. And eventually, there is alcohol. The person who first tasted it may not have understood what was happening. They didn't know about yeast. They didn't know about fermentation. They didn't know what ethanol was. They simply knew that this strange liquid tasted different and made them feel different. And that may have been enough. Because fermentation had another major advantage. It could transform food. Fermentation can preserve certain foods and drinks, alter their flavor, and make them easier to store or consume. So the first alcoholic beverages may not have been created simply because ancient humans wanted to get drunk. They may have emerged from experiments with food preservation and processing. In other words, alcohol may have been a side effect of humans trying to make food last longer. This is one of the major possibilities scientists consider when thinking about the origins of alcohol. And eventually, we find something much more concrete. In the Yellow River Valley of ancient China was a Neolithic settlement called Jiahu. Thousands of years later, archaeologists examined ancient pottery from the site. Inside the pottery were chemical residues, and those residues contained clues about what had once been inside the vessels. The evidence pointed towards something remarkable, a fermented beverage made from a combination of rice, honey, and fruit. The beverage dates to around 7660 BCE. That means humans were producing fermented alcoholic drinks roughly 9,000 years ago. And this wasn't simply a modern scientist looking at an old cup and guessing. The conclusion came from chemical analysis of ancient organic residues preserved in the pottery. The evidence suggests that Jiahu's inhabitants were deliberately producing a fermented beverage. So by this point, alcohol was no longer just an accident of nature. Humans had learned how to make it. But why? That question gets even more interesting. Today, we usually think of alcohol as something people drink socially. But in ancient societies, alcoholic beverages could have many different roles. They could be connected to feasting, rituals, medicine, social gatherings, and possibly religious ceremonies. At Jiahu, researchers have suggested that fermented beverages had social, religious, and medical significance. And thousands of years later, similar patterns appear across different civilizations. Alcohol wasn't simply a beverage. It could become a social tool. Imagine a large ancient gathering. Food is prepared. People travel from different places. Music plays, stories are told, and everyone shares a special drink. That drink isn't just liquid. It becomes part of the event itself. And this may explain something important about human history. Alcohol has a strange ability to change social behavior. It can reduce inhibitions, make people feel more relaxed, and in the right social environment, it can become part of bonding and celebration. So perhaps humans weren't only drinking alcohol for its chemical effects, they were also drinking because of what happened around the drink. Now comes one of the most fascinating possibilities. What if alcohol wasn't simply a product of civilization? What if alcohol actually helped bring people together in the first place? Consider Göbekli Tepe, an archaeological site in modern-day Turkey. The site is around 12,000 years old and contains evidence of large communal gatherings and feasting. Researchers have proposed that fermented beverages may have been part of these events. There are large stone vessels and evidence of intensive cereal processing. But here's where the story becomes controversial. Some researchers have argued that this evidence points toward very early beer production. Others have warned that the chemical evidence isn't strong enough to prove that every proposed beer residue was actually beer. So scientists are careful about saying humans built civilization because they wanted alcohol. We don't know that, but we do know that fermented drinks were appearing extremely early in human societies. And that creates a fascinating possibility. Maybe food and drink weren't just consequences of civilization. Maybe communal feasting, shared meals, and fermented beverages helped strengthen the social relationships that allowed larger communities to form. But there is still one mystery. Why does alcohol affect humans so strongly? The answer lies inside the brain. Ethanol is a psychoactive substance. After someone drinks alcohol, it enters the bloodstream and eventually reaches the brain. There, it affects multiple neurotransmitter systems. The result can include relaxation, reduced anxiety, impaired judgment, slower reaction time, and changes in mood. And this is where our ancient history becomes connected to the modern world. Our ancestors were exposed to small amounts of naturally occurring alcohol, but humans eventually learned how to concentrate it. Fermentation allowed people to produce beverages with much more alcohol than they would normally encounter in fruit, and later technologies made even stronger drinks possible. So the environment changed dramatically. Our biology didn't change nearly as quickly. A fruit containing a small amount of naturally occurring ethanol, and a modern glass containing a much higher concentration, are very different things. Yet our brains respond to the same molecule. Researchers studying human evolution have even found evidence that ancestral primates developed adaptations for metabolizing dietary ethanol long before humans invented deliberate fermentation. One study estimated that important changes in alcohol metabolism occurred in the lineage leading to humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas millions of years ago. That's an extraordinary thought. Our relationship with alcohol may be much older than alcohol production itself. So, why did humans start drinking alcohol? There probably wasn't one single reason. There wasn't one ancient person who suddenly said, "Let's invent beer." Instead, several things may have come together. First, nature was already producing alcohol. Fermenting fruit gave our ancestors low-level exposure to ethanol long before civilization. Second, humans became extremely good at experimenting with food. They learned how to store, process, mix, and ferment different ingredients. Third, fermentation could be useful. It could transform food and beverages, potentially helping with preservation and creating new flavors. And finally, alcohol became social. People gathered around food. They gathered around ceremonies. They gathered around celebrations. And eventually, they gathered around drinks. Once humans discovered that fermentation could produce a pleasurable and mind-altering substance, there was little reason to stop experimenting. Different cultures used whatever ingredients were available: rice, barley, grapes, honey, fruit, rits, and eventually, almost anything containing enough sugar or starch that could be converted into fermentable sugars. Across thousands of years, humans repeatedly discovered the same basic trick: give yeast sugar, and yeast gives you alcohol. But there's one final twist. The same biological system that may have helped our ancestors take advantage of naturally occurring ethanol can become a problem in the modern world. For ancient humans, fermented fruit was temporary, seasonal, limited. Alcohol was relatively difficult to obtain in large concentrations. Modern humans live in a completely different environment. Alcohol can be produced in enormous quantities. It can be stored for years. It can be made much stronger than naturally fermented fruit, and it can be available almost everywhere. So something that may have started as a tiny part of our evolutionary environment became an extremely powerful modern product. That doesn't mean humans evolved specifically to drink alcohol, and it doesn't mean alcohol is harmless. It means our relationship with alcohol has a very long history, and that history began long before bars, bottles, breweries, or even written language. So the next time you see a glass of beer or wine, remember what you're actually looking at. You're looking at the result of a process that began with something incredibly simple: sugar, yeast, time, and human curiosity. Somewhere in our distant past, someone noticed that nature could transform ordinary food into something completely different, and humans did what humans have always done. We experimented, we copied it, we improved it, and eventually, we built entire cultures around it. The strange part is that nature may have introduced us to it millions of years before we ever learned how to make it ourselves. And perhaps that's the real answer to the question: why did humans start drinking alcohol? Not because one person invented it, but because humans inherited a relationship with fermentation from nature, and then spent thousands of years turning that accident into a tradition. This is why science,